genuine conversations with unique minds on the threats, the complexity, and the geopolitics shaping our world. This is the Entropy Podcast with Francis Gorman. Hi everyone, welcome to the Entropy Podcast. I'm your host Francis Gorman. Before we dive in, if today's conversation challenges you, sparks a new idea, or sharpens how you think about the world, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who enjoys staying curious. Today I'm joined by Carle, a former CIA clandestine officer with 23 years of service, who retired as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats at the National Intelligence Council. Glenn is now a columnist for Newsweek in Japan, a senior partner in geopolitical risk advisory, and the author of The Interrogator and Education. Glenn, it's lovely to have you here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Glenn, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. I know Matthew Dunn, a previous guest of the show, gave us the intro, and I picked up your book and kind of read some of the details around your I suppose explanation of what it was like to work in a deep side as part of the CIA and an interrogation scenario after 9/11, and it was all fascinating insights there. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the show. And if anyone wants to pick the book up, it's of course called The Interrogator and Education, and you can get it on the internet or any major bookstores. But Glenn, what's really of interest is you 23 years in the CIA, so you had a depth of expertise, and I think that expertise is really useful to the modern world we live in, and that's really why I wanted to talk to you. And I'd like to start by talk a little bit about Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's mandate for leadership. You've been one of the more vocal former intelligence officers arguing it represents something structurally dangerous for American institutes. What impacts are actually materializing so far, particularly in the intelligence community, that you can see from a result of that change?
The whole government and actually American society is facing a challenge, actually a crisis, more serious than anything it has faced in its history. I'm speaking carefully here. It's the greatest, I often have said, the United States is confronting the greatest crisis to its institutions and society since the creation of the United States 250 years ago. It's greater than the Civil War, when the country was split in half and we massacred 600,000 of each other, because it challenges the institutions and the fabric of our national narrative and our beliefs. Even the secessionists in the Civil War accepted the precepts of the Constitution and American society. They just interpreted one specific point, which was slavery, which is worth the Civil War over, but only one specific point did they differ on. In this instance, everything from the beliefs to the structures to how individuals will live or have rights are all in threat. In the intelligence community, it has posed from the beginning of the Trump MAGA era an existential challenge, because the intelligence community exists in theory and by design in the United States to speak truth to power, not to serve the policy objectives of the state first by finding information that substantiates what the policymakers want or believe, but the contrary, to tell them as best the institution is able what the facts are, what the truth is. And politicians don't like to hear that often, because often the facts don't correspond to their hopes and their convictions. And when the institution is changed through pressure, through putting people who have a different conception of the role of government organs into positions of authority in the intelligence community and above us in the policymaking segments of the government, that changes the nature of the institution. And when you also, if you challenge what the leaders want to hear in this environment more than ever before, you'll be fired, removed, or prosecuted, denounced, destroyed. So, what is an intelligence officer or the intelligence agency to do? If you do your job, you risk your job. If you don't do your job, you betray your oath. If you do your job, you betray your oath. Uh, and CIA officers take their oath very seriously. It's not a a hokey, old worldy, dated kind of concept. Cynicism and skepticism and detachment are supposedly wisdom in our contemporary societies, but that truly is not how it is for most civil servants. Certainly in the agency, they take their oath very seriously. It is a sacred covenant. So what do you do? Uh, when you think that, well, whatever you might think, when one knows, and this is a fact, that some of the most critical intelligence that the United States can obtain and possess is immediately shared with the opposition, as in the Russians, and that has been documented to have happened. So if you share the information with your superiors, which is your job, then you betray your sources and possibly get them killed and compromise programs that might have cost billions of dollars to develop or to run, and you endanger the national security as it is understood by the institutions. It's an existential crisis. So it's paralyzed, I think, a lot of the functions of the CIA and the intelligence community, and it has made. I'm not there now. I'm on the outside, but I can only imagine it has made every level of the intelligence community wary of sharing its the fruits of its labors, its facts, discoveries, and assessments with the policymakers, because it's a career endangering and possibly a nation endangering act. It's an astounding situation we're in.
It seems to be truly unique, and it's a real kind of mirror to the world we live in at the moment. And the Russia connection, I'll come back to that a little later on in the conversation, because I do want to pull in that thread a bit and explore it a bit more. When when I'm watching the news at the moment, I kind of, as you would say, some things are almost humorous and others are directly shockworthy. And I think on April 7th, one of those shockworthy moments really became clear when President Trump posted on Truth Social that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. The White House has kind of played it down in terms of a pressure play that the president was trying to put against Iran to get leverage for them to come to the table. But as someone who spent his career assessing transnational threats, when the president of the United States makes a statement like that, what actually happens within inside the intelligence communities? How do they react to that? Because I'm assuming it wasn't scripted, or there wasn't an awareness that that was going to be said, and it was, I suppose, from the outside looking in, one of the most significant things a president has ever said openly while in power.
Well, it's an astounding situation we're in. I mean, the comedy show that is sort of culturally defining in the United States for 50 years is Saturday Night Live. Non-Americans may not be aware of this show, but it's a satirical program that generally pokes fun at national level political figures and social figures, actors, and so on. And the skits that they do, literally, are they aren't creative writing whatsoever. What they do is simply quote verbatim Donald Trump or his policymakers, his staff, and Republican supporters, because the things that they're saying and they're doing are so lunatic that the best satirical writers have no purpose really to write anything anymore. All you have to do is quote them. It's an astounding challenge or threat to our institutions, because we have a leader who, and I don't say this to insult, I say this to diagnose, trying to be objective here, who is emotionally about 6 years old and psychologically is a sociopath, and substantively is the most ignorant man, um, certainly to have held the office in 100 years, you go way back, you can probably find some fools who, well, you can certainly find fools who were president, but not many, and none who were malign in their intent because they actually disdained the institutions that they were leading.
Yeah, it is definitely unique, and I suppose hopefully we won't see it again in our lifetimes. But it's, yeah, it's a very strange situation we're in.
To say anything like it did immediately becomes a partisan issue, and you're challenged saying, "Oh, that's just because you're hostile to him and to Republicans, and because you're a liberal or you're a socialist or whatever." None of that is true in this instance. I don't. I mean, of course, I care. I have my own views on whether there should be capital punishment or not. There should be abortion or not. We should invade, attack Iran or not. We should lower taxes, raise taxes. All of those things are legitimate issues to have disagreements on. I really don't care. I can have the deepest respect for someone who disagrees with me on everything, so long as they accept the Constitution of the United States and what that obliges institutions and individuals who serve them to respect and to do. That's all there. All. I mean, it's not. I don't mean to dismiss it. That is the issue. It's not on the substance of political direction. So um, there has been nothing like this ever. And this does go back in a way that few could see. Uh, Political analysts, some did, some of my colleagues and I did, but we were on the inside. You referred to, and so therefore had access to dynamics and realities that an average person could not be aware of immediately. Uh, but you alluded to my book, and my book is about the enhanced interrogation program, which is actually torture program. But there is a larger issue going on, of which the torture, frankly, was a symptom, and it's really at the root of the whole Trump phenomenon. It's called the theory of the unitary executive power, or the theory of the unitary executive, which says that the American institutions are poorly designed and they're inefficient and they are ill-suited. They're unsuited for a superpower or for a country to engage in coherent international policy. All of those positions, all of those statements may well be correct. The U.S. Constitution was explicitly, intentionally designed to be inefficient because it was decided by the founding fathers inefficiency was preferable to tyranny. You didn't want to have any one power, faction, part of the government, or individual with too much authority. Thus, we have the separation of powers, and we have the Supreme Court that can override legislative acts, and on and on and on. All of the things that one should study, but no longer does in civics and in America and elsewhere, I suppose, too. So the theory of the unitary executive said this is no good. We have to bring power into the executive, meaning the president's office, the executive office, so that we can have an efficient government and we can exercise and project our power as we want. And as a superpower, we want to all any country wants to implement its policies, but we want to shape the world in the image that we wish. Well, fine. I'm happy to have America be strong and coherent. But that's what they said. So it was their objective. This is back when I was working. So we're talking 20 years ago now, actually. Say the year 2000, although these theories go back further, as you'll hear in a second. I'm sorry to be long winded, but I think it's really important. So they said we have to bring all the power into the executive, and that means eviscerating Congress and getting the power of the purse into the White House and the power of hiring and firing, the power for war and peace, the power to make laws, and so on. All of this, all of the power. So, well, okay, you can argue that should happen, but it is all unconstitutional. So, therefore, it is literally in the American system of government and society revolutionary. Now, maybe it is correct, but it is revolutionary. Now, where does that theory come from? There was, and this is really important, there was a prominent jurist and lawyer named Carl Schmitt, who wrote about this and elaborated this theory. And you think, okay, Carl Schmitt, maybe he's from the Midwest because a lot of Americans of German descent are from the Midwest. Well, no. Who was Carl Schmitt? Carl Schmitt was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer, the man who wrote the justification for Kristallnacht, which, for those who don't remember our German Nazi history, was the destruction of a night in which all Jewish establishments in Germany were assaulted by thugs. The windows were broken, the glass was shattered, thus Kristallnacht, the night of breaking glass. And he also justified the burning of the Reichstag, the German assembly, so that the Nazi Party could come to sole power in the hands of Adolf Hitler. He remained an apologist and an advocate for Nazism his entire life, all through the Nazi years. It is on that foundation and that model that the theory of executive power is written and derived. It is shocking, but they are quite sincere.
That's fascinating, Glenn, and I didn't know that. So that's a bit of history for myself that I didn't have before the conversation, which I'll definitely look into a bit more, because there's, I think to look back on our past is to know our future, sort of thing. So it's really important to kind of make these links back to history and kind of see the direction that was taken and the path that it led us to now.
So why did I tell that tale? Because Project 2025, which you asked about, is based upon the theory of the unitary executive. It is the fleshing out of the theories of Carl Schmitt and, frankly, the Nazi Party in American vocabulary. And much of Project 2025 is being implemented by Donald Trump and the Republican Party. So you can say, oh, well, this is all good. Low taxes are great. Centralizing power so he can protect us from illegal immigrants is great. Maybe those things are good. But the structure that it's happening in also has long-term consequences for your rights and mine, and whether you can walk down the street and look a certain way or say a certain thing. So we should all be aware and, frankly, infuriated and certainly terrified at what this implies.
Okay, well, that context just makes the roadmap that where we ended up a little bit more terrifying. So, thanks for the link, Glenn. That is, yeah, it's very worrying when you start to kind of draw those dots together. Let's let's talk about Russia for a minute. And you made a comment earlier that the intelligence agencies are almost fearful to share information because it could end up getting their counterparts killed because it's shared back with Russian intelligence. I assume was the takeaway there. You you've often referred to Trump as a Russian asset. I don't think in the general term as a spy, but someone who's been cultivated and influenced by Russia over the decades. Um, what is the assessment that has led you to that conclusion?
Mm-hmm. Therein is another huge, astounding tale, and some of your listeners might know Edgar Allan Poe, and the story that made him famous, and his most famous story from almost literally 200 years ago now, is the Purloined Letter. And where is the best place to keep a secret? Well, in that story, there was a secret letter that people had to find, and they searched everywhere, and they could never find it. And where was it? It was lying on the desk, open, in a stack of papers, and no one ever thought to look at something which was in plain sight. So keep that in mind with the story of Russian intelligence approaches and manipulation of Donald Trump and the American political system and American society. In intelligence, it's really important, or it is, no, for anyone, it is really important to understand that in intelligence, there are no coincidences. If what you do as an intelligence officer is, one, you try to hide what you are doing so that no one can see it, and two, the other perspective, on the other direction, you look for anomalies, something that's out of normal. You know, Glenn Carle goes to the dry cleaners every Tuesday, takes his daughter to football practice every afternoon after work. On Saturday, goes out with his wife to a restaurant, goes to church on Sunday. That's his routine. Well, one Tuesday he doesn't go to the dry cleaners. Well, maybe he had a cold, or he wore his shirt 3 days instead of one or something. Maybe, but maybe not. Who knows? And if the person is of any conceivable interest, Glenn Carle is a diplomat. He's not a shoe salesman in Manchester, New Hampshire. Then why did Glenn not go to the dry cleaners that day? And if it happens once, you still should pay attention to it if you have the resources to do so. If there are two anomalies, two coincidences, well, then every fire alarm in the entire building should go off, because you have to look at that as an intelligence officer. And if you don't, then you'll find yourself with your country invaded because you didn't see the signs. That happened. That explains every quote intelligence failure. You look at the October 7th Hamas attack of the Israelis, there were numerous signs over weeks that the Israelis did detect, but they didn't pay attention. It was anomalous behavior, and it was explained away as, oh well, they just moved their training schedule up a day because Ramadan is coming or something like that. But no. So that's what one has to look for. Now, in the context of Donald Trump and the Russians, the Russian intelligence service, the Russians are superb. They are superb. They do get a lot of things wrong. They have many delusions, but they're extremely professional, extremely so. And they think they can afford to be much more long term in their approach than Americans can, or even the British. The British can take a longer view than the Americans. There are structural reasons for that, but just take that as a given for the moment. So they play the long game. I had retired from the agency, and I was doing my normal life, and Donald Trump became he'd always been for 40 years he's been a public figure, but he became a national political figure in 2015 when he started to run for office. So fine. And I was just carrying on my normal life, and you can't help but do the job you've done your entire life, which is to assess people as an intelligence officer. And the job is to get them to break the law for you, to commit treason for you, to tell things that they shouldn't. And how do you do that? Well, there are many ways, but you have to look for vulnerabilities. And you think, well, what's a vulnerability? An obvious one is he likes money, he's corrupt, he has gambling debts, he's a womanizer, but he doesn't want his wife to know. These are obvious things, and they are real. But even someone who is as pure as I'm sure you are, or I am, uh, our strengths can be, in certain circumstances, vulnerabilities. Everybody, every human being has vulnerabilities. I love my children. What would I do to protect them? I wish my country success. What would I do to guarantee that if the crisis were great? Um, would I toe the line perfectly if it meant the failure of something that I held dear, dear, dear? Well, maybe I can just step over the line to do something greater. There are all sorts of vulnerabilities. So as Donald Trump carried on, ran his campaign, it was as though every ornament, light on the Christmas tree lit simultaneously. That he has more vulnerabilities than one can possibly imagine. It's like a textbook. So I thought, oh my gosh, this is really shocking. Why don't I think I'll write an article, and I will imagine that I am the uh, most senior Russian intelligence officer in Washington, and my job is to do what I just described, but against Americans. And so I wrote a hypothetical field assessment of Donald Trump and his vulnerabilities. And I said, here are his vulnerabilities, and here is what I, as Sergei Russian intelligence officer, proposed to do with them. So I put myself in my old job, except I turned the telescope on the other direction against themselves. And then I thought, you know, that would be an alarming thing to read and be interesting and sort of fun to read. And I thought, wow, it's pretty sensitive. I don't know about this. So I sent it to a colleague I hadn't spoken with for several years who travels around Europe as part of his job. He's not in the agency, not in the intelligence community. Saying, well, what do you think of this? I mean, do I dare submit this? This is a little controversial, you know, in cutting. And I had not heard from the person for years, and I got a phone call the next morning from this person, which was a surprise, and said, Glenn, I read your article. I think um, you are on to something more significant than you might realize. Let me tell you what I am hearing. This is in 2015, the very end of 2014, early 2015. I meet with the European intelligence services, and a number of them have told me, respectively, that they are concerned because they have information either from their own officers, counterparts of me, but in MI6 or who knows where, or from contacts of the intelligence services that are reporting instances in which a known Russian intelligence officer or someone known to be in association with Russian intelligence has been meeting with or has met with either Donald Trump, members of his family, members of his entourage, or members of his campaign. This is very alarming. And I went, oh my God, that's shocking. So I thought this is much more serious than I even imagined. So I then reached out to other people who had associations with the U.S. intelligence establishment, and I said, "This is what I have been thinking. This is what I just have been told. This is really alarming. What do you think?" And the person reached out uh, had more senior and relevant contacts than I do. I don't have any contacts anymore, really, and said, "Let me make some calls. I'll see what we hear." And he called me back and he said, "Okay," and this person's not quite a generation, but significantly older than I am, a good deal older than I am. So let me tell you what I'm hearing and the context that I can put this in. He had worked in counterintelligence in the 60s, and he said at that time, the obsession of the head of counterintelligence which is a famous person in the intelligence world named James Jesus Angleton, um, was with Russian penetration of the CIA, and uh, we had something that we called in the agency the monster plot. It's a bad name, but that's what they called it. And he said, "Let me tell you what the monster plot was. It was our fear that the Russians, the Soviets at the time, were trying to um, create, develop, and then sort of guide a candidate to become president of the United States." And we took this very seriously. We looked really hard. And we finally assessed, our conclusion was that they could not do it, but it wasn't for want of desire. And that then became uh, actually the true basis of the movie The Manchurian Candidate in the 1960s, and then another one with Denzel Washington a decade ago, I guess. And then this contact said, so our assessment then, Glenn, was that they couldn't do it, but that it wasn't for want of desire. But that was 40, almost 50 years ago. And times have changed. American society is not the same. Technology is much different. And so, but the objectives of the Russians remain as ambitious as ever. So, what you're saying is alarming. Then he found out that, and this came out in the media, that the intelligence community was concerned about, had information about Russian intelligence being active with people who had known associations with the Trump campaign, one of whom is named Paul Manafort, who went to jail essentially for being a an agent of the Russian intelligence, who was President Trump's campaign director and who was deeply involved in Russian disinformation and manipulation and covert action operations in where? Ukraine. Uh, so the intelligence communities briefed what's called the Gang of Eight. Those are the eight most senior elected officials, uh, not in the executive branch, really. And they are the only ones briefed on the gravest matters of national security, not the oversight committees in Congress, just those eight, which would be the Republican, the majority and minority leaders in the Senate, in the Congress, the Vice President, the Speaker of the House. That's two, four, six, and there are two others that slip my mind for the moment. No matter, they're briefed on these threats, and we are told, says the person I talk with, that they came out of this briefing ashen faced. But what had then happened? The FBI, I think it was, because they have the lead on law enforcement and counterintelligence, said we would like to take the following steps. And they were forbidden to do so by the then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican, who said, no, those are partisan acts and they're hostile to the Republicans. You will do no such thing. And they were ordered to stand down on pursuing this. And then history played out as we know, with increasing alarm about Russian contacts and the denunciations of that alarm and those actions by Donald Trump and his supporters as partisan. And then the counterattacks continue to this day, where the former head of the CIA, a man named John Brennan, whom I know well and have a great deal of respect for, is still, they're trying to prosecute him, and on and on and on. But the indications were widespread. Now, I'll just give a little data point, and then I'll stop yammering for a moment. A couple of data points to make this more concrete for the listeners. There are over, I forget the exact number, but over 400 documented instances, publicly documented, in which have been substantiated. You can go to the sourcing of contact of known Russian intelligence officers or people known to be associated with Russian intelligence with Donald Trump, members of his family, members of his campaign, his entourage, or senior officials related to him in the last 20 years or something. That's publicly known. It is known that the Russians dangled a Trump Tower next door to Red Square and the Kremlin, because what greater carrot is there to enticement to Donald Trump than that? It is known that Trump Tower in Toronto, which went bankrupt, as many of the Trump enterprises have, the day before its foreclosure, and to the tune of hundreds of millions of Canadian dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds or euros. A Canadian immigrant from Russia said, I have just learned about this wonderful investment opportunity. Please let me guarantee it because I think it's a great idea. And so he bailed out the Trump Tower in Toronto. Trump bought an apartment or a house, I'm not sure, in the south of Florida. Well, very good for him. It cost, I think, $20 million. This is decades ago. He never set foot in it. That's fine. He sold it shortly thereafter. That's also fine for $60 million. Great business deal. To whom? To someone associated with a Russian oligarch. Now, what does one need to know about Russian oligarchs? One, the kleptocracy of the Russian economy and society since the fall of communism has been astounding. And yet, no Russian oligarch may expatriate any of his money without the okay of the Russian intelligence services in the Kremlin, meaning Vladimir Putin. And if you don't toe the line utterly, you will then fall out of a window someplace in the United Kingdom. there have been, and that's not a joke, there have been, I think, 49 mysterious fallings out of windows in Great Britain of Russian immigrants who have run afoul, fallen out of windows as a result of the Kremlin because they said the wrong thing or were doing something that was threatening in any way the power of Vladimir Putin. So none of these steps financially occur without the knowledge of, and frankly, the guidance of, indirectly or directly, of Russian intelligence. So one of those instances would be alarming for an intelligence officer. Over 400 for a person in a position of national authority is astounding. It's a tremendous success for Russian intelligence, and no one has succeeded in holding anyone almost to account in the United States as a result.
Glenn, when you overlaid that information with the war in Ukraine and I suppose Putin's hybrid war on Europe more widely, from a European perspective, it kind of makes a lot of sense. And the constant attack of NATO in the round as well. There's a lot of parts of the jigsaw that come together when you lay it out that way, and people can draw their own conclusions. And we probably need another couple of hours to go into that piece in detail. But that is a fascinating insight that I think will get people to pause and kind of recap on what's been said here and try and understand it in a bit more detail.
Donald Trump's first visit to Moscow was, I'll get the specific dates a little off, but fundamentally this is correct. It was in 1982 or something to that effect. He had his first meeting, I think it was, with senior Russian people that we have no knowledge of. Um, a young, attractive woman, and that is a relevant statement in this story, from Russia contacted Donald Trump in the late 70s or early 80s, 79 or 80, at a time when he was he had just built Trump Tower in Manhattan, and this was the talk of the town kind of thing, and said, "Oh, this is such a beautiful building. Very interesting to see this." My father, who was the former ambassador uh, of the Soviet Union or Russia to the United States or the UN, I forget which, is interested in this sort of thing. I wonder if possibly we could impose on you. Could I please ask, would you be willing to give us a tour of Trump Tower before my father, leaves town and returns to Moscow? And so, of course, Trump said yes, and so they struck up this relationship. Uh, what do you have to do if you're an intelligence officer? You have to identify a target and then figure out a way to gain access to the target. So, pretty good. Um, and so, after that, shortly after that, he was invited to Moscow to start the Holy Grail pursuit of a Trump Tower adjacent to the Kremlin. And I'm sorry to laugh, but okay. And so he went, fine, and that became the basis of the huge controversy on this tape, which has strange sexual practices alleged and so on. You can put that to the side. I mean, true or not, put that just to the side. Although I will guarantee you that any Westerner with any wealth or prominence, and even not, who travels to Russia will be paid attention to. And that the rooms that he stays in or she stays in will be bugged. That's just guaranteed. But okay. So what happened after this trip? Donald Trump comes back home, and within a week, there was an article, feature article, saying, and this was 1982 or something like that. Donald Trump should run for president. Will he run for president? What a president he would make. Let's consider this. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump starts talking about how his uncle had been a professor of physics at MIT. And so, therefore, Donald Trump was a genius in nuclear armament negotiations, and that he should be leading the nuclear arms reduction talks of the United States with Russia because his uncle, had taught physics 25 years before at MIT or something. I don't know. I mean, one can only laugh at these things, but we continue to hear this every time the issue comes up from his own mouth. So all of a sudden, this is now floated, and no one takes this seriously. This is 1982. The publication was a lunatic magazine run by Lyndon LaRouche, who's a whole other story. But he's one of the kinds of people who has his disciples standing on street corners. This is literally true. In 1984, no, when was it? 19, I forget what year I was in Berlin, but it was a year of American presidential election, and there were Lyndon LaRouche disciples handing out campaign literature in Berlin for the American presidential campaign for their own candidate, which at the time was Lyndon LaRouche. So they're a little out of the norm, let's say, um, and they have a lot of fringe ideas. But that was the venue. But that does not matter from an intelligence perspective, because how does intelligence work? Particularly with AI and the internet today, but how does it work? It doesn't matter what your first venue is. You want to get a message out. So what do? You can't go to Glenn Carle, who writes for the New York Times, because I'm not going to write something that's not sourced and seems a little cockamamie. I'm going to make sure I have three corroborating sources, and I'm going to weigh the pros and cons. I'm going to do responsible journalism. But if you give it to a fringe magazine, it doesn't matter. They publish Donald Trump should be president of the United States because his uncle was once a professor of physics at MIT. Um, but then what happens? And this is now where the laughing should stop, because a small outlet somewhere in Europe says the American media source, such and such, has talked about Donald Trump as a prospective presidential candidate. Then what happens, and who knows what the origin of that magazine is, or the journalist, is that a news service like the Associated Press or something will be doing its job, and it will see, Glenn Carl Jr. reporter someplace will see, gosh, there have been 4 or 5 different news reports about Donald Trump running for president. Maybe there's something to this. And so I write the article saying multiple news sources indicate an interest of Donald Trump and some segments of the population in Donald Trump running for president. And all of a sudden, out of nothing, you have a real news story. That's what happens all the time. And that's what happened in this instance. So the 1982 tour of Trump Tower by the attractive daughter of a departing ambassador was a foundational act, most likely, in this whole chain of what seemed to be laughable and cockamamie events, but which are gravely serious and have had world changing consequences.
It's absolutely fascinating, Glenn. It's I can't even describe, it's like pulling back the blinds and all of a sudden seeing the full picture, and the way you've put it together and pieced it together, where you sow a seed and the seed then grows branches, and those branches then become kind of the structure of something that is actually not factual but becomes part of our reality, and it
Real,
kind of plays
and
into.
something else that I'm sorry to keep, you've obviously pressed the button here, but something else that's really important. You think, well, this is lunatic. I mean, who would ever take a failed real estate developer from Manhattan seriously as a presidential candidate? Well, but that's still someone who's engaging with substantial amounts of money in a major city. You could say, why should we take seriously Glenn Carl, who grows organic tomatoes in eastern Massachusetts in the United States? Seriously. Well, probably you shouldn't in either case. But what you do as an intelligence officer is, you don't only bet on one horse. If you sow 100 different, I'm mixing all sorts of metaphors, but if you throw 100 different seeds into the ground, maybe one of them will sprout at some point. That's a better metaphor than what I had before. And that's what you do, and that's what will happen at some point. One of these things will actually succeed, and there where the long game comment I made about the Russians was really relevant, because they do invest in a lot of these uh, incipient operations or feelers and so on, in a way that at least American services can't. Don't We don't devote, generally speaking, 40 years to an operation. That's an astounding achievement. It's brilliant, uh, work as an institution, and the Russians do.
Glenn, thank you very much. That was really insightful. So it was, and you bring a really unique angle to the intelligence field that is really valuable for people in technology and business and in geopolitics, just to understand and try and piece together. So I really do appreciate that. We're nearly up on time, but there's just one last question I'd like to ask, if that's okay. Um, your book, you were made rewrite it a number of times by the CIA, and they redacted about 40% of the content that you initially had written. But you left in that blacked out content anyway. Can you tell me why, or was there a reason for that? Was that just let me show how much is missing, and how much of the truth still out there?
Well, that was the initial thought. Your last comment, yeah. So the agency redacted, which means censored, about a third, actually 40%. You're right, of the initial 100. Why am I laughing? Of the initial 100,000 words I wrote, they took out 40,000. And now they have a legal right and obligation to protect sources and methods of intelligence. And that I can totally accept that. That is a completely legitimate function. You don't want a former officer to say, well, our one of our assets was Vladimir Putin's secretary or something, or here's how you can penetrate a telephone service in country X. That would be a terrible thing, of course. But none of the stuff that I wrote, I take my oath very seriously, and I was very careful. None of its sources and methods. The stuff that was redacted was politically embarrassing and sensitive about a program the administration didn't want to talk about, which was torture. That's why they took it out. And I'll give just one example of the level of nonsense. Frankly, it was, and a lot of the people I have the greatest respect for who were doing this, because it is a real job, legitimate job that they must perform under their own pressures too. But that said, at one point, at one point, I said, I will quote myself. I said, I found myself surrounded by football-sized stones, unquote. And they took that out. And I was meeting with a panel of them. There was myself on one side of the table and 5 censors on the other side. And they said, "You can't, you can't take that out. That has nothing to do with a source or a method." And first they said, "Yeah, well, sue us," which of course I could do, but you can't win that. There's on one side an individual, on the other side the United States government. You aren't going to win that. Uh, and then, and I said, "Well, look, the entire," and I used a bad word. I said, "The entire bloody world is made out of rocks. So when I sue you, the judge will laugh your ass out of court." So that's a slightly softened version of what I said. And they looked, and I remember the person opposite me turned her head 90 degrees to her colleague and said, "Shall we give him stones?" And they debated for a moment, and she looked back and she said, "You may keep stones." And so I was able to I was able to put in that I had found myself surrounded by football-sized stones. That's what the 40,000 words were to a large extent, because they didn't want a book, they being the administration and the agency, didn't want a book about torture to come out, which is, who would want a book of torture to come out? The redactions were left in just to show the extent of the intrusion, actually. And then, to my surprise, and here I hadn't anticipated this, it became a big part of the life and the story of my book, because people understand black lines on a page. They might not understand the theory of unitary theory of executive power, or whether a certain act constitutes torture or not, or even whether we should or we shouldn't do it as American officials. But they do understand uh, having being muzzled or having tape put over your mouth, and so that became a big part of the story. Thank you. Anytime.
Thanks very much.